The trauma monitor flatlined at 11:47 p.m., and nobody moved. 30 seconds. 40. The attending physician stood frozen at the whiteboard, marker still in hand, while two nurses pressed themselves against the wall. The patient, male, mid-40s, chest caved in like a collapsed building, was dying in real time on a gurney that hadn't been locked in place. Then the night nurse stepped forward. Not fast, not dramatic. She moved the way water moves around a stone, quiet, certain, purposeful. Her hands found the chest before anyone else had even processed what was happening. "He's tamponating. Someone get me a 14 gauge, now." Nobody questioned her. They just ran. If you've made it this far, stay. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The emergency department at Redwood Regional Medical Center in Ashford, Oregon, had a particular smell at night, bleach underneath everything, then old coffee, then something chemical and faintly sweet that nobody ever named out loud. Emily Carter had worked the night shift there for 2 years, and she had stopped noticing the smell sometime around month 4. What she had never stopped noticing was the sound of the overhead lights. They buzzed at a frequency that most people tuned out. Emily couldn't. She had spent too many years in environments where background noise was data, where everything in a room either mattered or could kill you. She was restocking a supply cart near Bay 6 when Dr. Victor Hale's voice cut across the department. "Where is she?" He didn't look up from his tablet. The night float. Carter. The charge nurse, Bev Quintero, a solid woman in her late 50s who had seen enough to stay quiet when she needed to, gestured toward the hallway. "She's restocking, Dr. Hale. We had a busy—" "I don't care what we had." He finally looked up, and the expression on his face was the particular kind of impatience that comes from never having been told no. "Get her out here." Emily heard it. She set down the IV tubing she was counting, took a breath through her nose, and walked back into the bay. Hale was already moving toward her before she arrived, tablet under one arm, the other hand gesturing like he was dismissing someone from a podium. "I need you to know," he said, loud enough that 2 residents and a nursing student could hear every word, "that your documentation on the Morrison case was incomplete, your vitals check at 0200 was 12 minutes late, and I've had 2 complaints from day shift about handoff quality." Emily looked at him steadily. "Which complaints?" "That's not your concern." "It is if I'm being held accountable for them." He blinked. Not many people on night shift talked back to Victor Hale. He had the kind of face that made people small, angular, permanently certain, with a jaw that seemed designed for pronouncements rather than conversation. He had trained at a prestigious East Coast program, published in 3 journals, and reminded people of both facts whenever the room temperature dropped below his comfort level. "Get her off my board," he said, turning to Bev. "I don't want her touching my patients tonight. She can restock until morning." "Dr. Hale, we're short." "Then we're short." He was already walking away. "She's useless in a crisis. We saw that with the Marchetti kid last week. I don't need a liability in my ER." He disappeared around the corner toward the physician workroom. The nursing student, a young man named Dario, who had only been there 6 weeks, looked at Emily with an expression that was somewhere between sympathy and horrified fascination. Emily met his eyes for a moment. Then she picked up her supply cart and went back to work. She didn't tell anyone that the Marchetti kid had been stable because of a dosing adjustment she had caught before the order was even signed. She didn't tell anyone that the incomplete documentation on Morrison had been because she'd spent 40 minutes talking a terrified woman through a panic attack that the attending had diagnosed as GI distress and walked away from. She didn't tell anyone these things because telling them would have required a conversation with someone who was already certain of the answer, and certainty in the wrong person was more dangerous than almost anything she had ever encountered in any room, in any country, under any set of circumstances she had been asked to survive. Emily Carter had learned that lesson the hard way, in places that didn't appear on any map that civilians ever looked at. She was deep in the supply corridor, counting blood draw kits and entering numbers into the inventory tablet, when she heard the first crash. Not a cart falling. Not something dropped. The crash had weight and direction. It came from the ambulance bay, and it was followed immediately by shouting, and then by the particular quality of silence that falls when a room full of people all stop breathing at the same time. Emily set down the tablet. She moved back toward the main department at a walk, not a run. Running told you things before you had information, committed your body before your mind had finished working. She turned the corner into the trauma corridor and stopped. 4 men had come through the ambulance entrance. 3 of them were standing. One was being dragged, a large man, heavily built, with a wound in his left side that had soaked through what looked like 3 layers of clothing. His face was the gray-white of significant blood loss, and his breathing was audible from 15 feet away, short, wet, and wrong, in a way that Emily's body registered before her conscious mind finished cataloging it. The 3 men standing were holding weapons. 2 handguns and something larger slung across the back of the one nearest the door, which Emily clocked and filed in under 2 seconds without moving her head. They had the posture of people who had rehearsed aggression, shoulders wide, weight forward, weapons visible, because the visibility was the point. Making you afraid was the first part of the plan. The department had locked down on instinct. Patients in the hallway had been pulled into rooms. The front desk clerk had hit the floor behind her station. 2 nurses were frozen at the central workstation with their hands visible, and Bev Quintero was standing very still near the medication room doorway, both palms open at her sides, which was exactly and precisely the right thing to do. Dr. Hale was standing near the physician workroom with his tablet still in his hand. The man in front, mid-30s, close-cropped hair, a cut above his left eye that had been recently cleaned but not closed, spoke first. His voice was controlled, not panicked. That was more dangerous than panicked. Nobody moves. Nobody calls anyone. We need a doctor. He scanned the room. His eyes moved efficiently, which meant this was not his first time doing something like this. Right now. Hale stepped forward. Emily watched him do it and understood immediately what was happening. He was going to try to control the room the way he controlled every room, through the sheer weight of his own authority, through the assumption that his status would function as a kind of armor. It was the single most dangerous thing he could do in the next 30 seconds. I'm Dr. Victor Hale. I'm the attending physician on duty tonight. If your friend needs treatment, I'm going to need you to. I didn't ask for a name. The man with the cut above his eye, Emily filed him under leader, shifted the gun until it pointed at Hale's chest with the casual precision of someone who had done this before. I said I need a doctor. You treat him, you all go home. You waste my time, this becomes a different kind of night. Hale went still. The tablet dropped another inch. Behind the leader, the other 2 had fanned out, one covering the hallway toward radiology, one near the main entrance with eyes on the waiting area. The wounded man had been lowered to the floor just inside the ambulance bay, back against the wall, one hand pressing the wound with diminishing pressure. His lips were going pale at the edges. His eyes were half open and tracking nothing. He had maybe 8 minutes of viable intervention window left, possibly less. Emily walked forward. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. She simply moved from the edge of the corridor into the open space of the trauma bay with the same energy she'd used while pushing the supply cart 20 minutes ago. Unhurried, purposeful, already thinking 3 steps ahead of the moment she was standing in. Hey! The second gunman swung toward her. Stop. Who are you? Night nurse. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the wounded man on the floor, running a fast visual assessment from 10 feet out. Entry wound left lateral abdomen. No visible exit, saturated dressings, respirations shallow and fast. Skin color indicating significant volume loss. Your guy on the floor is bleeding into his abdominal cavity. If I don't touch him in the next few minutes, he's going to code right here, and then none of this matters to anyone. The leader looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. You're a nurse. Yes. We need a doctor. He's not going to help you. She said it without inflection, without any particular cruelty, just as a plain fact about the situation. She glanced briefly at Hale, who was still standing in the same position with the same frozen expression. He's in shock. I'm not. So the question you have to answer right now is whether you want someone who can actually help or whether you want the title. The room was very quiet. The leader looked at the man on the floor, looked back at Emily. Something worked through his face that wasn't entirely readable, but it ended in a decision. He jerked his chin toward the wounded man. Do it. You try anything. Someone in this room gets hurt. I understand, Emily said, and went to work. She knelt beside the man on the floor without hesitation, already calling over her shoulder as she moved. I need gloves, a trauma kit, 2 large-bore IVs, O-negative blood from the trauma fridge, and a pressure infuser. Bev, you hear me? From across the room, in a voice that was steady and low. I hear you. Don't run. Walk. Keep your hands visible the whole time. Got it. Emily pulled the man's shirt aside and looked at the wound. It was a single entry, left lower quadrant, with a trajectory that suggested the liver might be involved, but the primary bleed was coming from somewhere vascular and fast. The dressings his companions had pressed to it were soaked through in the pattern of arterial involvement. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck. Pulse was there, but thin and fast, the kind that was burning through what reserves he had left. What's his name? He asked, without looking up. Doesn't matter, the leader said. I'm going to have to talk to him if he regains awareness. It'll go better if I have a name. A pause. Marcus. Okay. She kept her voice level. Marcus, my name is Emily. I'm going to take care of you. I need you to stay with me. No response. His eyes were fully closed now. That was not a good direction. Bev arrived at the edge of the bay with the trauma kit and gloves, moving carefully with both hands in view, the kit held out in front of her like an offering. One of the gunmen tracked her the entire way. Emily took the kit without breaking her assessment, snapped on gloves, and began working with the kind of focused economy that didn't look impressive unless you knew what you were watching. She packed the wound with gauze, applied direct pressure with precisely calibrated force, enough to compress, not enough to send a clot into motion, and began talking Bev through setting up the IV access at the same time. 2 peripheral lines, large bore, both antecubital. She got the first one herself while Bev secured the second. The whole thing took under 3 minutes. Blood, Emily said. Coming. The third gunman, the one near the entrance, was watching her with an expression that had started as contempt and was slowly becoming something else. She's good, he said, to no one in particular. The leader didn't respond. He was watching Emily's hands. The O-negative blood arrived in a cooler that Bev had retrieved from the trauma fridge without being asked. Emily connected it to the pressure infuser, squeezed the bag to drive volume, and monitored Marcus's color while she worked. His lips were still pale. His pulse was still wrong, but his breathing steadied, just fractionally, as his pressure came up off the floor. He needs a surgeon, Emily said. There's a bleed I can't reach without an OR. Not happening, the leader said. I'm not asking you to take him anywhere. I'm telling you what the situation is, so you can make an informed decision. She looked up at him for the first time since she'd started working. You can keep him alive in this room for a while. You cannot fix what's wrong with him in this room. Those are the 2 facts you're working with. He stared at her. She held his eyes without difficulty. Who are you? He said. I told you, night nurse. Night nurses don't talk like that. She went back to monitoring Marcus's vitals. You're asking the wrong question. Something about that answer landed strangely in the room. The leader's expression tightened in a way that suggested he recognized the shape of it, the kind of answer that confirmed exactly nothing while communicating something significant. He took a step toward her. I need you to stay where you are, Emily said, without looking up, because if you get between me and my patient, I lose visual and someone dies tonight who didn't have to. He stopped. From across the room, the second gunman let out a short, disbelieving breath. She's something else. Nobody disagreed. The next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled emergency that looked calm from the outside but was running at absolute maximum capacity underneath. Emily maintained Marcus's blood pressure with sequential infusions, monitored his respiratory rate, kept talking Bev through the supply needs in short, quiet sentences. She identified a secondary laceration on his upper arm that had been missed entirely and closed it with a pressure dressing while managing the abdominal wound simultaneously. She did all of it on a floor with inadequate lighting under the supervision of 3 armed men in scrubs that were now covered in blood up to both elbows. The leader watched her the entire time. The second gunman, younger, with the angular restlessness of someone who ran on adrenaline and hadn't figured out yet that it was a limited resource, drifted toward her during a quiet moment when Bev had gone to retrieve more gauze. He crouched down a few feet away, studying her hands on the wound. The gun was in his right hand, pointed loosely at the floor. You ever done this before? He asked. Like field stuff, not hospital. Emily looked at the trajectory of Marcus's breathing before she answered. I've worked a lot of different environments. Where? Doesn't matter. He watched her for a moment longer. You're too calm for a nurse. People keep saying that tonight. She adjusted her grip on the pressure dressing without pausing. It's not a useful observation. It's an observation about you. Then keep it to yourself and let me work. He stood up and moved away, but he was looking at her differently than he had been 20 minutes ago. Not with attraction, not with admiration exactly. With the particular wariness of someone who has encountered something they don't have a category for. Bev returned with gauze and an extra set of vitals cuffs. As she knelt to hand them over, she angled her body so the gunman's sight lines were briefly broken, and in that window she said very quietly, close enough that only Emily could hear, "Police have been called." Silent alarm. Emily received this information without any change in her expression. She continued rapping. How long? Dispatch said 8 to 12 minutes. That was 6 minutes ago. 2 to 6 minutes then? Maybe less. Emily ran the math on the room. 3 armed men, positions she had been tracking the entire time. A trauma bay full of terrified staff. A critically ill man on the floor whose condition was stable but not secure. 6 minutes could be forever or nothing, depending entirely on what happened in the first 30 seconds. Okay, she said, at the same volume. Take the O-neg back to the fridge. Tell anyone you pass to stay in whatever room they're in and get low. Bev nodded once, stood, and walked away without hurrying. The leader had been watching this interaction. He crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched down across from Emily with the gun at his side. Close enough now that she could see the cut above his eye clearly. It was about 2 centimeters straight-edged, the kind you got from flying glass or the corner of something metal. His eyes were dark and precise, and he was looking at her face the same way he would look at a map he didn't entirely trust. What did she say to you? She asked me if we needed a different blood type, Emily said. I told her we were fine. He stayed where he was. His eyes moved across her face for several long seconds. You're lying. Okay. What does okay mean? It means you're probably right, and it doesn't change the fact that I'm in the middle of keeping this man alive. She kept her hands moving. You want to have a conversation about honesty? We can do that when he's stable. Right now I need you to either help me or move back. He didn't move. Who are you? And I want a real answer this time. I'm the person who decides whether Marcus lives or dies in the next few minutes. Everything else is details. He stared at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stood and stepped back. Emily exhaled slowly, silently, through her nose. She checked Marcus's pulse again. It was stronger. Not right, but stronger. And the color at his lips had moved from gray-white back toward something that suggested his body was still fighting. She had bought him time. She had bought herself time. She could hear very faintly the sound of sirens. Still several blocks away, but coming in fast and not slowing down. The leader heard it at the same moment she did. She saw it in the way his body went taut, the way his head turned fractionally toward the exterior wall. That's for something else, the younger gunman said. Nobody in the room believed him. Emily assessed the situation in the time it took her to swap out a blood-soaked dressing. 3 men, one significantly distracted by the approaching sound of sirens, one monitoring a hallway that was now empty, one watching her from 6 feet away. The distance between her and the supply cabinet where the trauma shears were stored was approximately 4 feet. The distance between the leader and the ambulance bay exit was 12 feet, which was 3 steps too far for what he was about to try to decide to do. She was calculating options in a part of her mind that had never entirely gone quiet in 2 years of night shifts and supply carts, and being told she was useless, when the leader turned to her with something definitive in his expression and said, "We're leaving. You're coming with us." Emily looked up from the wound she was managing. "I'm not," she said. "That's not a choice you get to make. Marcus goes into hemorrhagic shock the moment I stop managing this bleed." She held his eyes. "You brought him here because you needed someone who could keep him alive. I can keep doing that, or I can stop and follow you out the door. Both of those are choices. Pick one." The sirens were 2 blocks out now. Maybe 1. The younger gunman was at the ambulance bay entrance, looking out through the narrow window beside the door. "Lights," he said. "Multiple units. Coming this way." The leader looked at Emily with an expression that was rapidly running out of options to land on. "Don't," she said quietly, and she wasn't talking about the gun, though he didn't know that yet. From somewhere deeper in the hospital, far down the corridor past radiology and the imaging suite, came the sound of a door crashing open, heavy and sudden, followed by the kind of coordinated shouting that had a completely different texture than civilian panic. Short, directional, controlled. Emily recognized it immediately. Her hands stayed exactly where they were. The gunman near the hallway entrance heard it too. He turned from the radiology corridor and said, "Someone's in the building, from the back." The leader's head swiveled between Emily and the corridor entrance and the ambulance bay exit, the calculation on his face becoming something frantic and overloaded. That was the moment Emily moved. Not toward him. She reached up and to her left, to the supply cabinet at the base of the gurney, pulled it open, and removed the trauma shears in one clean motion. Not as a weapon, she held them openly, turned so the blades faced away from everyone. She pressed them into her left hand and kept her right hand on Marcus's wound. "Whatever you're going to do," she said to the room, very calmly, "do it now, because this man's blood pressure just dropped again, and I need both hands." The leader stared at her. The shouting from the corridor was getting louder, and it had acquired a rhythm that Emily's body recognized from somewhere deep and specific. The kind of systematic room clearing she had participated in, once, in a different life, in a different country, in conditions that made a hospital trauma bay look like a quiet afternoon. The younger gunman took 2 steps back from the ambulance bay door, and his voice had lost its adrenaline edge and found something that sounded a great deal like fear. "There are too many of them. We go now or we don't go." The leader looked at Emily one final time. She held his gaze without moving. He turned and went for the ambulance bay door. Emily watched him go. She watched all 3 of them go. The leader, the younger one, the third one who had never said a word all night. And then she turned her full attention back to Marcus, who was breathing in shallow, rapid cycles on the floor of a trauma bay that smelled like blood and industrial cleaner, while somewhere behind her the door crashed open and the voices became individual words. And the words were commands, and the commands were coming from people who moved through rooms with a specific kind of deliberate certainty that she recognized the way you recognize a language you used to speak fluently. She kept her hands on the wound. A figure appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision, tactical gear, weapon raised, and then immediately lowered as the person registered what they were looking at. A woman crouched over a patient. Blood, IV lines, a pressure infuser, the entire apparatus of someone trying very hard to keep someone else alive. "Ma'am," the voice was controlled and professional. "Police. Are you injured?" "No," Emily said. "But my patient needs an OR in the next 30 minutes, or we're going to lose him anyway. Is there a surgical team in this building?" A pause. "We can get one here." "Then do that." She kept her eyes on Marcus. "The 3 men who were here went out the ambulance bay 30 seconds ago, maybe less." She could feel the officer's hesitation, the question of who she was, how she knew these things, why she was so steady, and she could feel the moment he decided that those questions had a lower priority than the patient and the fleeing suspects. "Copy that," he said, and got on his radio. Bev Quintero appeared in the corridor entrance, moving fast now that the immediate threat had cleared. She had a second blood bag and a portable vital signs monitor, and her expression when she took in the full scene, Emily on the floor, patient alive, the systematic professional calm of every decision that had been made in the last 45 minutes, was complicated in ways that would take a long time to fully work through. Dr. Victor Hale appeared a moment later, still holding his tablet. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the IV lines, the wound packing, the blood pressure reading on the cuff Emily had applied. He looked at Emily's hands, still working. Whatever he had been expecting to see, it wasn't this. "I'll take over," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier authority. It came out careful and a little strange, like words he was feeling the shape of before he let them go. "He's stable enough to move," Emily said, without looking up. "BP is 90/60. Not good, but not crashing. He needs imaging before anyone touches that abdominal wound, because there's something going on near the hepatic flexure that I can't evaluate without—" "I know what needs to happen," Hale said. Emily looked up at him then, for the first time in the exchange. His face was still angular and certain, but something had shifted in it. A layer had come off, or maybe a layer had been added, something he hadn't had on it 3 hours ago when he told Bev to pull her from the patient board. "Okay," Emily said. She began transferring control of the wound, talking him through the pressure points and timing with the same even tone she would have used with any competent colleague. At the edge of the room, the young nursing student Dario had come back, drawn by the clearing of the threat and the arrival of people in uniforms. And he was standing very still near the supply cart, watching Emily, the way you watch something you don't have a word for yet. His expression was doing something complicated that had nothing to do with fear. From the ambulance bay, a burst of radio traffic indicated that the 3 fleeing men had been encountered 2 blocks away. There were more units responding. The night was far from over. But in the trauma bay, for just a moment, there was something close to quiet. Emily stripped off her bloody gloves and pressed them into the biohazard bin. She stood and felt the small protests of a body that had been crouched on a concrete floor for 45 minutes. And she looked at Marcus's chest rising and falling with something that was, for now, sustainable. Outside, in the parking lot adjacent to the ambulance bay, a dark vehicle had pulled in without lights. Not police, not EMS. It sat at the edge of the lot, engine running, and the 2 figures who stepped out of it were not in police uniforms. They wore civilian clothes with the particular fit and posture of people who were never fully off duty, and one of them was on a phone, speaking rapidly and quietly, and the other was looking at the building entrance with the kind of focus that doesn't come from curiosity. Bev noticed the vehicle first, from the window near the ambulance bay door. She watched it for a moment, then turned to find Emily. Emily was already looking at it, and the expression on her face in that moment, just before the professional calm resettled over it like a door closing on something that had been briefly and accidentally left open, was not the expression of a night nurse watching strangers in a parking lot. It was the expression of someone who had just recognized something she had spent 2 years hoping would never find her. She turned away from the window before Bev could ask the question that was forming on her face. The 2 figures from the dark vehicle hadn't moved toward the entrance yet. They were standing at the edge of the lot, and one of them, the one on the phone, was looking at something flat and rectangular, a tablet or a folder, and the other was watching the ambulance bay door with the kind of patience that wasn't passive. It was the patience of someone who had already made all their decisions and was simply waiting for the environment to catch up. Emily knew that posture. She had worn it herself, in other parking lots, outside other buildings, in the hour before things that couldn't be undone. She moved to the supply sink and ran water over her hands, scrubbing blood from the creases of her knuckles with the mechanical focus of someone who needed something to do while thinking. The trauma bay around her was shifting into its next phase. Police officers establishing a perimeter, an EMS supervisor coordinating Marcus's transport, Dr. Hale issuing instructions in a voice that had recovered some of its usual authority, but not quite all of it. The department was doing what emergency departments do after a crisis, metabolizing the event, converting chaos back into procedure, making the extraordinary fit inside the ordinary frame. Emily was not metabolizing anything. She dried her hands and turned to find Bev directly behind her, which was not a surprise. Bev Quintero had worked 30 years in emergency nursing and had the particular skill of appearing exactly where she needed to be at exactly the moment she was required, without making a sound getting there. "You need to sit down," Bev said. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. I said you need to sit down." She said it the way she said most things, without argument, without softening, just the plain shape of what was true. "You've got blood on your neck. You didn't notice." Emily touched the side of her neck. Her fingers came away with a faint, rust-colored smear. "Transfer from handling this, probably." She'd leaned over him at one point to check his breath sounds and hadn't thought about the angle. She went back to the sink. "Those 2 in the parking lot," Bev said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. "You know them?" "No." The word came out a fraction too fast, and Bev heard it, and Emily knew she heard it, and neither of them said anything about it. "Police are going to want statements from everyone. Hale already gave his." A pause. "It was mostly about Hale." Emily almost smiled. "That tracks." "He didn't mention you, in terms of what you did. I thought you should know." "It doesn't matter." "Emily." Bev's voice changed register. Not louder, just more direct, the way a door becomes a wall. "What you did tonight was not nothing. You kept that man alive on a concrete floor with a first aid kit and sheer nerve for 45 minutes while 3 armed men were in this room. That is not nothing. Somebody needs to say that out loud." Emily looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her own face, familiar and a little foreign the way faces get after you've been running on adrenaline for a long time and the engine is starting to cool. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't from the fluorescent lighting. She looked, she thought, like someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and hadn't put it down yet. "Someone will," she said, "just not tonight." She turned back to the room before Bev could respond and walked toward the eastern corridor where she could see the two figures from the parking lot had finally come through the side entrance. They were being met by the senior officer on scene, a broad-shouldered man named Lieutenant Greer, whom Emily had interacted with twice before on trauma cases. He was listening to one of the new arrivals with the expression of someone receiving information they hadn't asked for and weren't entirely comfortable with. Emily stopped at the edge of the corridor and watched. The taller of the two, a woman in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a coat that was too good for the weather and the hour, was doing the talking. She had a badge case open in her left hand, but she held it at an angle Emily couldn't read from this distance. The second figure, a man, was scanning the room with the systematic efficiency of someone conducting an immediate threat assessment on an environment they'd just entered. His eyes moved across staff, cameras, entry points, and briefly, specifically, stopped on Emily. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Then his eyes moved on, and Emily exhaled and went to go write her incident report. The report took 40 minutes because she wrote it correctly. Precise times, precise observations, nothing embellished and nothing omitted, in the exact sequence it had occurred. The nursing station where she sat was quiet, except for the low traffic of officers moving through and the occasional burst of radio. Dario, the nursing student, had been asked to sit in the waiting area pending a statement, and he'd done it without protest, though he'd looked at Emily once as he passed with the same unfinished expression he'd been wearing since she'd put her hands on Marcus's wound. She submitted the report at 1:43 a.m. and was reaching for her water bottle when someone sat down across from her. The woman from the parking lot. Up close, she was sharper than distance had suggested. A face that processed things quickly, eyes that had learned to give away only what they chose to. She set a credential case on the desk between them and left it open. Special Agent Donna Reyes, Department of Defense, Inspector General's Office. Emily looked at the credentials for 2 seconds. Then she looked at Reyes. "Ms. Carter," Reyes said. "Agent Reyes. You've had a busy night. The report's already in the system if that's what you need." "It's not." Reyes folded her hands on the desk. She wore no rings. Her nails were short. She had the hands of someone who had done field work before moving to whatever this was. "I want to ask you some questions that aren't in any report." Emily waited. "The techniques you used tonight to manage the penetrating abdominal trauma, the sequential pressure infusion, the manual hepatic compression through the wound packing, the specific sequencing of your volume resuscitation protocol." Reyes paused. "Those aren't standard nursing curricula. They're not civilian paramedic protocols either. I've taken a lot of continuing education courses. The particular combination you used is specific to a battlefield hemorrhage management module that was developed for Special Operations Combat Medics in 2014. It's been modified twice since then. The version you used tonight corresponds to the most recent modification, which was finalized in 2019 and has never been published in any civilian medical journal." The corridor was very quiet. From somewhere deeper in the hospital, the sound of a gurney moving, wheels on linoleum, the soft hydraulic hiss of an elevator. "That's an interesting observation," Emily said. "We've had it confirmed by 2 physicians who were watching through the observation window during the last 20 minutes of your intervention." Reyes pulled a folded document from inside her coat and set it on the desk without opening it. "Your name in this system is Emily Carter, night nurse, licensed in Oregon, prior experience listed as..." She glanced at the document. "Community health clinics in Northern California, a rural hospital in Idaho, and 1 year of travel nursing in the Pacific Northwest." "That's accurate." "It's accurate and it's incomplete." Reyes said it without accusation, just as a statement of structural fact. "I'm not here to threaten you, Ms. Carter. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because what happened in this room tonight was observed by people who recognize what they saw. And those people have questions that need answers before this gets routed to a level where you have less control over how those answers are delivered." Emily's hands were flat on the desk. She was aware of exactly how still she was sitting, and she was aware that Reyes had noticed it, and she was aware that Reyes had almost certainly noted it in whatever mental file she was building. "What exactly are you asking me?" Emily said. "I'm asking you who you are. The real version." From the far end of the corridor, the male agent, who had never been introduced, was standing near the ambulance bay entrance, talking quietly to Lieutenant Greer. His body was angled so that he could see Emily and Reyes at the nursing station. He wasn't trying to hide this. It was a structural message. There are two of us and one of you, and we have already made certain arrangements with the people in this building. Emily understood the message. She had delivered similar ones herself, in a previous iteration of her life. I need to understand the scope of this conversation, she said. Are you operating under a specific directive, or is this preliminary? Reyes blinked. It was a small tell, quickly controlled. The question was not one she'd expected from a night nurse in bloody scrubs. Preliminary, she said after a moment. Then I'd like to know who flagged this before I say anything else. Another pause, slightly longer. One of the responding officers noticed the combat application tourniquet technique you used on the secondary wound. He's a former Army medic. He put in a call at 0100 an hour ago. While Emily had been finishing her documentation, someone had already been making phone calls. She did the math on that quietly and found it didn't improve her situation. I see, she said. Ms. Carter. Emily. Reyes leaned forward slightly, and for the first time something beneath the professional surface became briefly visible. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of someone who had once been on the other side of a conversation like this one. Whatever you've been doing for the past 2 years, wherever you've been, the record doesn't explain tonight. And when a record doesn't explain what people saw with their own eyes, the record becomes a problem. Not just for us. For you. Emily looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the folded document on the desk. She looked at her own hands, still faintly stained at the nail beds despite the scrubbing. I'd like to speak with legal counsel before this goes further, she said. Reyes nodded once, as if this was the response she had anticipated. That's your right. We're not detaining you. She picked up the document and returned it to her coat. But I want you to know that the 2 individuals who came in with the gunmen, the ones who escaped, were apprehended 40 minutes ago, 3 blocks from here. The third one is still at large. She stood. He knows what you look like. He knows what you did tonight. And based on what we've found on the 2 we have in custody, this was not a random incident. She left that sentence where it was and walked back toward the ambulance bay entrance without waiting for a response. Emily sat at the nursing station for another 2 minutes without moving. Then she stood, went to the supply room, and began restocking the cart she had abandoned 4 hours ago, because she needed something to do with her hands while the part of her mind that had been quiet for 2 years came back online. It came back online like a machine that hadn't been shut down cleanly, rough, in stages, with the specific weight of things that had been stored rather than resolved. She had kept it quieter than she'd thought possible. 2 years of 12-hour shifts and supply carts and documentation and being told she was a liability. And underneath all of it, that part of her had stayed dormant, waiting, the way certain things wait with infinite patience for the conditions to change. The conditions had changed. She was counting IV tubing, 48, 49, when Dario appeared in the supply room doorway. He'd clearly been released from the waiting area but hadn't gone home. He was still in his scrubs, which meant he'd been there the whole time, and the expression on his face was the one that had been building since midnight, finally reached the point where it needed somewhere to go. I have to ask you something, he said. Okay. He came into the supply room and let the door swing closed behind him. He was 23 or 24, she estimated. Young enough to still be surprised by what people turned out to be capable of. Old enough to understand that the surprise mattered. What you did tonight, he started, then stopped. I've been in 3 clinical rotations. I've watched attendings, I've watched residents, I've watched experienced nurses handle codes and trauma and all kinds of things. He paused again. I've never seen anyone do what you did tonight. Not like that. Not the way you... It was like you'd done it 1,000 times. Not in a hospital. Emily continued stacking IV tubing. You asking a question or making an observation? Both, I guess. He leaned against the shelf across from her. Who are you? Actually, she looked at him directly. He held it, which not everyone managed to do. I'm a night nurse who's been on shift since 7 p.m. and needs to finish this inventory before 6 a.m., she said. That's not an answer. I know. She picked up the next box. Go home, Dario. Write your incident statement while it's fresh, sleep if you can, and come back tomorrow. That's the job. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The woman who was talking to you at the nursing station, who was she?" "Someone with questions." "Same questions I have?" "Different ones." She set down the box and looked at him again. "Go home." He went, but not happily, and not before looking back once from the doorway with the expression of someone filing something away rather than letting it go. Emily finished the inventory alone. At 3:20 a.m., she was in the break room with a cup of coffee she wasn't tasting when Dr. Victor Hale came in. He looked at her for a moment from the doorway, the same way he'd looked at her in the trauma bay after Marcus's blood pressure had stabilized, with the layered, complicated expression of a man recalibrating something he'd been certain about. And then he came in and sat down at the other end of the table. He didn't say anything immediately. He poured himself coffee from the carafe, and the small sounds of that occupied the room for a while. "Marcus Duval is in surgery," he said finally. "The OR team found a hepatic laceration and a nicked mesenteric artery. The chief of surgery said the hemorrhage management prior to arrival was," he paused, choosing the word, "exceptional. She said if he'd arrived in the condition most patients in that situation arrive, they wouldn't have had anything to work with." Emily drank her coffee. "I told them the night nurse had managed him on scene," Hale continued. "They asked which nurse. I told them your name." "Okay." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. His fingers were long and precise. Surgeon's hands, or close to it, the kind that were trained to be confident in small spaces. Tonight they looked uncertain. "I said something at the start of shift that I shouldn't have said." He didn't look at her when he said it. "The Marchetti comment, and removing you from the board. That was—" He stopped. Started again. "It was wrong." Emily looked at the table. "I know it was wrong," he said. I want you to know that I know." "Noted," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution. And from the way he received it, she could tell he understood that. He nodded once, stood, poured most of his coffee down the sink, and left. Emily sat with her cup and thought about the third gunman who was still out there. The one who had watched her hands and told his companion she was too calm. The one who, according to Donna Reyes, knew what she looked like and what she'd done, and was presumably, at this moment, somewhere in Ashford making decisions about what to do with that information. She thought about Reyes's document and the phrase she hadn't finished. This was not a random incident. At 4:05 a.m., Lieutenant Greer knocked on the break room door and came in with his hat in his hand and the look of a man carrying more information than he was comfortable with. "Ms. Carter, I need to let you know something about the two individuals we have in custody." She set down her cup. "Go ahead." "The wounded one, Marcus Duval, has a jacket that connects him to a trafficking operation that's been under federal investigation for 7 months. The other two we picked up are part of the same network." He paused. "What we're finding in their phones suggests they came to this hospital specifically, not randomly. There's communication from 3 days ago referencing Redwood Regional, referencing the night shift, and he stopped. Emily waited. "Referencing a specific nurse," he said. "We can't fully decrypt the message yet, but the timing and the location are specific enough that our federal liaison is treating it as targeted." The break room was very quiet for a moment. "They came here for me," Emily said. Greer's expression was careful. "That's one interpretation. We're not confirming. Lieutenant," she said it without sharpness, just cutting to the shape of things. "They came here for me." He looked at her, and the carefulness in his expression shifted to something that was closer to honest. "The federal team thinks so, yes." She nodded slowly. This changed several things she'd been calculating and confirmed one thing she'd been trying not to confirm for the last 2 hours. Whatever she had spent 2 years outrunning had found her, and it hadn't found her by accident. Someone had looked for her specifically, in a specific city, on a specific shift, and had sent people who were not asking questions politely. The fact that Marcus Duval was in surgery instead of dead on her floor was, under these circumstances, not necessarily good news for her. It meant there was a witness to what she'd done, and witnesses in networks like the one Greer was describing had a tendency to become problems. "Is there somewhere secure in this building?" she asked. Greer blinked. There's an office suite the hospital uses for administrative lockdowns. Security door, no exterior windows. I need to be somewhere that's not the break room for the next few hours," she said, "and I need someone to tell Agent Reyes that the conversation she wanted to have earlier, I'm ready to have it now. Greer nodded and reached for his radio. Emily stood and picked up her coffee cup, though she didn't drink from it. She looked at the door, then at the window above the sink, which showed a rectangle of pre-dawn parking lot, still dark, still wet from the earlier drizzle. She thought about the third gunman somewhere in that dark, making his calculations. She thought about Donna Reyes and her folded document and her question, "Who are you?" the real version. She thought about what it had cost her, 2 years ago, to become Emily Carter, night nurse. Nobody important, invisible by design. And she thought about Marcus Duval's blood on her hands and the way the department had gone still when she'd spoken, and the young officer who had recognized a tourniquet technique and made a phone call, and the chain of things that phone call had set in motion. And she understood with the cold clarity of someone who had spent years reading situations from the inside out that the chain was not going to stop. The door to the break room opened and Reyes came in, coat still on, tablet in her hand now instead of a folder. The male agent was visible in the corridor behind her, speaking to Greer. Reyes looked at Emily and didn't sit down. "You said you were ready," she said. "I said I was ready to talk," Emily said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" Emily set down the coffee cup. "Talking means I decide what you learn and in what order. That's the only version of this conversation that happens." She held Reyes's eyes. "If that's acceptable, we can start. If it's not, I'd like the number for a JAG attorney, because I have reason to believe my situation has legal dimensions that go beyond what you've disclosed." Reyes studied her. The tablet in her hand was dark, screen off, which meant she wasn't recording yet, or was recording in a way that didn't require the screen. Emily noted this without comment. "That's an interesting way to start a preliminary conversation," Reyes said. "It's the only way I know how to start one," Emily said. "Accurately." Something moved across Reyes's face that might, in a different context, have been appreciation. She pulled out the chair across from Emily and sat down, and she put the tablet face down on the table between them. "Okay," she said. "Your terms. For now." Emily nodded and began to speak. She had gotten 3 sentences in, carefully chosen sentences, each one true and none of them sufficient, when the radio clipped to Greer's belt in the corridor outside erupted with a burst of controlled, urgent traffic. Reyes was on her feet before Emily registered the words. But Emily registered them first. The third gunman had been located. He was inside the hospital. He had come through the loading dock on the east side of the building 18 minutes ago, which meant he had been inside during every conversation Emily had just had, and he had not come back empty-handed. And what the dispatcher was saying now, in the clipped and rapidly deteriorating radio traffic that Emily was parsing faster than Reyes was that he had taken someone from the radiology corridor. The name the dispatcher said was Bev Quintero. Emily was already moving before Reyes had her radio up. Not running. Moving with the particular economy of someone who had stopped filtering their body through their conscious mind and was operating on a layer underneath that, faster, cleaner, less burdened by the question of whether to act. She went through the break room door and turned east without hesitation, and Reyes was 3 steps behind her, which was 3 steps more than Emily had expected. "Carter." Reyes's voice was controlled but carrying. "You don't go in there ahead of—" "Where in radiology?" Emily said, not slowing. A half second. Reyes was talking to her earpiece. "Imaging corridor B, between the MRI suite and the staff stairwell." Emily knew that corridor. She knew the dimensions of it, the door placements, the fact that the staff stairwell at the eastern end had a fire door that locked from inside but could be held open with the wedge that the overnight orderly used when he was moving equipment. She knew there was no camera between the MRI suite door and the stairwell because the camera that had been mounted there had been broken since November, and the work order had been pending for 3 months because nobody in hospital administration had treated it as urgent. She knew all of this because she had spent 2 years learning a building the way she used to learn terrain. "How long since last confirmed sighting of the subject?" she asked. Reyes relayed the question, got an answer. 7 minutes? 7 minutes in a contained corridor meant he was either still there or had moved into the stairwell. If he'd moved into the stairwell, he could be on any of 4 floors. If he was still there, he was there for a reason, and the reason was leverage. They turned into the main radiology corridor, and Greer was already there with 2 officers. All of them stopped at the junction that led into Corridor B, positioned correctly, not stacked at the entrance where they'd be silhouetted, pressed to the wall on the hinge side. Greer looked at Emily with the expression of a man who had not yet decided whether her presence was an asset or a complication. "What's the status?" Reyes asked him. "Subject is confirmed in the corridor. He has the charge nurse, Quintero, and he's made verbal contact with one of my officers. Says he wants a vehicle and a 30-minute head start or—" Greer stopped. "Or what?" Emily said. He looked at her. "He says he'll hurt her. He mentioned you by name. He said he'll hurt her until you come in." The corridor was quiet enough that the hum of the MRI equipment was audible through the wall. Emily processed this information and did not let her face do anything with it. "He's baiting," she said. "Yeah," Greer said. "He is. That means he's not sure what he has. If he knew what he had, he wouldn't need to bait." She looked at the junction. "Is Bev ambulatory? Any indication of injury?" "My officer heard her voice about 4 minutes ago. She was talking. He was telling her to stop talking." Bev was conscious and arguing with her captor. That was very Bev, and it was also tactically relevant. A hostage who was engaging verbally was a hostage who was buying time, and Bev Quintero was smart enough to know that buying time was the job right now, even if she couldn't know exactly what she was buying it for. "What's his armament?" Emily asked. Greer looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at Emily. "One handgun confirmed," Reyes said. "Possibly a secondary. We don't know." One confirmed. Possibly a secondary he hadn't displayed, which meant either he had one and was holding it back strategically, or he didn't have one and had implied it to keep the count uncertain. Both scenarios had different response logic. "He came through the loading dock," Emily said, 18 minutes ago. If he was carrying 2 weapons, he would have had to get them into the building, which means he had them on his person when he came in. Loading dock has a security checkpoint. "It's unmanned at this hour," one of the officers said. "Camera?" "Feeds to the security desk at the main entrance. The guard there confirmed he saw the subject on camera but didn't flag it in time." "So we have a footage of him coming in." Emily turned to Greer. "Is he on camera in the loading dock? Can your security team tell from the footage whether he was carrying under his left arm or right? The way he moves his elbow when he walks." Greer was already on his radio. Reyes stepped close to Emily. Close enough that the conversation was between them and not the room. "You're not a responder here. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I need you to understand that this is a police situation and you are a civilian." "I know what I am," Emily said. "Do you? Because the way you're reading this room doesn't match the employment file I pulled this morning." "Then your file is incomplete. You said so yourself." Emily looked at her steadily. "He asked for me. Which means the moment you send anyone into that corridor who isn't me, he knows you've rejected his terms. That changes his calculations." She paused. "You have maybe 12 minutes before he decides waiting isn't serving him. And you want to walk in there. I want to get Bev out of there. Those aren't always the same thing." Reyes's jaw tightened. She was running the math on something, and from the shape of her expression, the math wasn't landing where she wanted it to. From the radio on Greer's belt. "Footage confirms single-handed carry, right side coat pocket. No left side movement, no secondary visible. One weapon, right side pocket carry, not holstered, which meant draw time was slower and access was more awkward from a grapple position." Emily filed this and moved on. "I'm going in," she said. "Not as a responder. As what he asked for." She looked at Greer. "Keep your team at the junction. Don't move them in until you hear something definitive. Because if he hears boots on the floor before I have eyes on the situation, Bev is the first thing that changes." Greer looked at Reyes. A long moment passed between them. "I can't authorize a civilian to—" Greer started. "You're not authorizing me," Emily said. "He asked for me. I'm responding. Those are different things legally, and you both know it." She looked at Reyes. "You want the real version of who I am. This is part of it." Reyes held her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she stepped aside. Emily turned and walked into Corridor B. The corridor was 60 feet long, poorly lit at this hour. The overhead strips ran at half power between midnight and 6, a cost-cutting measure that nobody on the night shift had ever managed to get reversed. The MRI suite was on her left, heavy door closed, the low electromagnetic hum of the machine in standby coming through the wall. On her right, 2 closed doors, a storage room and a staff bathroom. At the far end, the fire door to the stairwell, and in front of it, partially visible in the low light, 2 shapes. One of them was Bev. Emily walked at a steady pace, not slow enough to seem hesitant, not fast enough to seem aggressive. She kept her hands visible at her sides, and she kept her breathing at a rate that her body could sustain, because control of her own physiology was the one variable in this corridor she could actually manage. "That's close enough." The third gunman's voice came from the shadows near the stairwell door. He was positioned with Bev in front of him, which was correct defensively but limited his mobility. He had one hand on Bev's arm and the other, Emily checked, near, but not in his coat pocket. Gun accessible but not drawn. He hadn't decided yet. Emily stopped. She was 30 feet away. "You asked for me," she said. "I did." His voice was steadier than she'd expected. He was the one who had watched her hands during the treatment, the one who had told his companion she was too calm. Up close in the dim light, he looked younger than she'd thought, late 20s, with the lean, watchful quality of someone who had grown up having to read rooms quickly. "I wanted to see if you'd come. Here I am." "Here you are." He shifted his weight slightly. Bev was rigid but not struggling. She was doing the right thing, staying still, conserving her options. "You want her back? You tell me who you are. Not the nurse story, the real thing." "Why does it matter?" "Because Marcus is in surgery right now because of what you did, and Marcus knows things about people I work for that those people very much don't want in a courtroom. And if you're just a nurse, none of this makes sense. But if you're something else," he paused, "then someone sent you, and I want to know who." Emily looked at him. In the low light, she could see the specific tension in his frame, the calculation running underneath the surface, the thing he was trying to decide. How was genuinely uncertain. That was both useful and dangerous. Uncertain people made sharp decisions or terrible ones, and the margin between those outcomes was narrow and usually determined by the first thing that happened next. "Nobody sent me," she said. "I work nights here. I have for 2 years." "Then explain tonight." "I can't explain it in a way that'll make you feel better about your situation," she said. "But I can tell you that whatever you're trying to protect by being in this corridor right now is already gone. The 2 men you came in with are in custody. The communication on their phones has been pulled. The people you work for already know this operation failed." His hand moved toward his pocket. Stopped. "I'm not saying this to threaten you," Emily said, and she meant it. "I'm saying it because you're 20-something years old, and you came back into this building alone, and whatever story you were told about what would happen if this went wrong, the part of that story about how someone would come for you, I need you to think very carefully about whether you believe it." A long silence. The MRI suite hummed. "Let the nurse go," Emily said. "She's 61 years old and she has a hip that's been giving her problems since February, and she's been on her feet for 9 hours. She's not useful to you, and she's not what you came back here for." Something in his expression shifted at the specificity of it. The hip, the 9 hours, the particularity of knowing those things about a person. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I pay attention to people." Emily kept her voice level. "It's the job. Let her go." Bev, to her enduring credit, took this moment to say in a voice that was steady and dry and completely characteristic, "I would genuinely appreciate that." Something almost happened on the third gunman's face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, quickly suppressed. His hand released Bev's arm. He hadn't planned to. Emily could see that he hadn't planned to. It had happened in the space between one decision and the next, in the gap opened by the specificity of a hip problem and 9 hours on your feet, the way real details could sometimes get through the surface of a situation that abstraction couldn't. He looked at his own hand like it had moved without him. Emily said, "Bev, walk toward me." Bev walked. Stiffly, quickly, with the compressed urgency of someone who had been holding herself very still for a long time. She passed Emily, and Emily said quietly, without turning, "Keep going, all the way to the junction." "Already gone," Bev said. And she was. Now it was just the 2 of them in the corridor. The third gunman's hand was at his pocket again. But he hadn't drawn, and the calculation on his face had become something more complicated than before. The arithmetic of someone who had just made a decision they hadn't planned to make and was trying to figure out what that meant for the rest of the decisions in front of them. "You let her go," Emily said. "That matters. Doesn't change what I came here for." "What did you come here for?" He looked at her for a long moment. "To find out if you're going to be a problem." For who? For the people who sent Marcus to this hospital 3 nights ago. Emily went very still. Not physically. Her body stayed exactly as it was, hands at her sides, weight balanced, 30 feet between them. But something shifted in her internal register because that sentence had a shape she hadn't anticipated. Marcus came here 3 nights ago, she said. He was here. He was watching the shift change. Watching you. His eyes were steady on her now. Whatever decision he was making had apparently been made. You made somebody nervous. Somebody up the chain. They sent Marcus to find out if you were who they thought you were. Who did they think I was? He shook his head. That's the part I don't know. I'm not that far up the chain. He shifted his weight again. But I know that when they saw what you did tonight, the call went out in the first 20 minutes. Not to run, to confirm. Confirm what? That you're the one they've been looking for. He paused. I don't know what that means, but it means something to them. And people who have reasons to find specific people in specific places, those aren't small-time reasons. Emily processed this in silence. The corridor hummed. The fire door at the far end was slightly ajar, held open by the wedge exactly where she'd expected it, which meant the stairwell beyond it was potentially accessible to anyone who had been listening. She said, "Put the gun on the floor." He looked at her. "You've already made the decision," she said. "You let her go. You told me what you know. The only question is what happens in the next 30 seconds. And if you put the gun on the floor, the answer to that question is significantly better than if you don't." Better for who? Both of us. She held his eyes. Mostly you. A long moment, the kind that felt longer than it was. His hand went into his pocket, came out with the gun. He crouched down and set it on the linoleum floor with the careful deliberateness of someone who had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. And then he stood back up with his hands at his sides. Emily exhaled once, clean and controlled. "Step to your left," she said, away from the stairwell door. He did. Emily moved forward, picked up the gun without looking away from him, cleared it in one practiced motion, and set it against the wall out of reach. She had crossed half the distance between them when the fire door at the end of the corridor, the one that had been held open by a wedge, swung wide. Not Greer's team. She would have heard boots. This was single footsteps, light and deliberate, and the person who came through the door was moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who had not come through the loading dock 18 minutes ago, but had been in this building considerably longer. He was older, 50s, well-dressed in a way that had nothing to do with tonight's climate, and the thing he was carrying was not a gun. It was a phone, held up, and on the screen was something recording, and he was looking at Emily with the specific expression of someone who had found what they were looking for. "There she is," he said quietly, to the phone. Not to the room. To whoever was on the other end. The third gunman behind her said, "I didn't know he was here. I swear I didn't know." Emily was already assessing. One exit behind her, the junction, 60 feet, with Greer's team on the other side. One exit ahead, the stairwell, through this new person. The corridor offered no cover worth mentioning, and the lighting was wrong for almost anything. The man with the phone looked at her with the satisfied, settled expression of someone checking a task off a list, and he said, "We have a mutual acquaintance, someone who knew you before Ashford, before the night shifts," he paused, "before you disappeared." Emily said nothing. "They'd like to speak with you," he said. "And based on what I've just watched you do in this corridor, I think you understand that this conversation is going to happen one way or another." The phone in his hand rotated slightly. The camera was pointed at her face, and from the small speaker, through the thin digital audio of a live call, came a voice that Emily had not heard in 2 years, a voice she had specifically, deliberately, exhaustingly arranged never to hear again, and the voice said her name. Not Emily Carter. The other name. The one on the file that Donna Reyes had been trying to open all night. The name hung in the corridor like something physical. Emily stood with the cleared gun against the wall behind her and the man with the phone 4 feet in front of her, and the voice coming through the speaker. And she did not move, and she did not respond. And the specific quality of her stillness was not the stillness of someone who had been caught. It was the stillness of someone running very fast calculations in a very small amount of time. The voice on the phone said her name again. The real one. The one that belonged to a service record that had been classified at a level most people in that building would never have clearance to read. "Sergeant Voss," the voice said. "It's been a while. The man with the phone, 50s, well-dressed, patient in the way that money makes people patient, watched her face with the focused attention of someone who had been told exactly what to look for. Emily looked at the phone. At the small rectangle of screen, the live feed pointing at her face, the darkness behind whoever was speaking. She thought about the voice. She placed it. It took her 4 seconds, and when she placed it, she understood several things simultaneously, the way you sometimes understand a whole structure by seeing one corner of it clearly. Harlan, she said. Not a question, a confirmation of her own math. A pause on the other end. Then, you remember. I remember everything, she said. That was always the problem. Deputy Director Raymond Harlan. Defense Intelligence. She had worked 2 operations under his indirect authority, which meant he had read her reports without her knowing he was reading them. And she had never met him face to face, and the last time his name had appeared in anything connected to her life, it had been on a document she had found 6 weeks before she resigned. A document that should not have existed, that described an operational decision that had been made above her pay grade and below her team's awareness, and that decision had cost her 4 people in a valley outside a city she was not allowed to name. She had spent 2 years not saying his name out loud. You've been very hard to find, Harlan said through the phone. The identity was good work. Whoever helped you build it knew what they were doing. I built it myself. I know, that's why it held as long as it did. A pause. The quality of his voice was the quality of a man who had spent decades in rooms where power was distributed unevenly and had learned to speak in ways that reflected this without quite stating it. We need to talk about what happened tonight. We're talking. In person, not through Declan's phone. Declan presumably was the well-dressed man in front of her. He had the look of someone who had been introduced by first name as a professional courtesy in enough rooms that he'd stopped noticing it. I'm in a hospital corridor, Emily said, with at least one law enforcement agency on the other side of that door. In person is a complicated ask. I'm aware of your situation. That's why I'm calling. Another pause, and this one had texture to it, the texture of something being decided in real time. The investigation that Agent Reyes is running. Her mandate is narrower than she's told you. She was sent here for a specific reason, and that reason isn't your welfare. Emily processed this without letting it show. What reason? There's a leak in the IG's office. Has been for approximately 8 months. The same 8 months that the trafficking network you inadvertently disrupted tonight has been operating without federal interference despite 3 separate tip-offs. He paused. Reyes knows about the leak. She doesn't know she's sitting next to it. The corridor hummed. Declan was watching Emily's face with the focused patience of a man who had been told this conversation would be instructive. You're telling me the federal agent who's been asking questions about my identity all night is compromised, Emily said. I'm telling you someone in her office is. Whether it's Reyes directly or someone 2 desks away from her who has access to her case files, we don't know yet. A pause. What we know is that the moment your name came up in Reyes's preliminary report at 0100, someone in that network received a notification. That notification is why Marcus Duval's associate came back into this building. Someone told him you were here and what you'd done and that you were being questioned. Emily stood with this for a moment. The math was unpleasant, but it ran cleanly. Reyes files a report, someone in her office reads it, someone in that someone's network makes a call, and an armed man comes back through a loading dock with a phone and a name and instructions to confirm. What do you want, Harlan? She said. It wasn't hostile. It was the voice of someone cutting to the only question that mattered. I want what I've wanted for 2 years, he said. I want to fix what happened to your team. I want the record corrected. And I need someone who understands the ground level of this network in a way that 8 months of federal investigation apparently hasn't produced. You want me to come back? I want you to consider it. That's a careful way to say it. I'm a careful person. A pause. Sergeant Voss, whatever happened in that valley, you deserved answers. You still do. And the people who made the decision that cost you your team are still making decisions, still in rooms, still with authority they shouldn't have. His voice remained level throughout. I can give you the file. The real one. Not the version that was submitted. The third gunman, who had been standing against the wall this entire time, very still, apparently having concluded that his best outcome now was invisibility, made a small sound. Not a word. just the sound of someone recalibrating every assumption they'd walked into this corridor with. Emily looked at Declan, at the phone, at the fire door behind him, and the stairwell beyond it, and the floors above and below that she had been thinking about since the conversation started. "I need 24 hours, she said. "You have 12, Harlan said. "After 12, the window on the file closes, and Reyes's report becomes the official record, which means Emily Carter, night nurse, becomes a federal person of interest in an active investigation, and the name Voss stays buried, and everything your team died for stays unaddressed." He let that sit. 12 hours. "Declan will give you a number." The call ended. Declan lowered the phone. His expression was professionally neutral. He held out a card, actual paper, which told Emily something about how Harlan's operation was structured. He said, 12 hours, and walked back through the fire door, and the door swung closed behind him, and Emily stood alone in the corridor with the third gunman and a set of new problems arranged on top of the old ones like sediment. She picked up the gun from against the wall, verified it was still cleared, and looked at the third gunman. "What's your name?" she said. He blinked. "Why?" "Because you told me the truth in here, and I'd like to know who I'm talking to." A long moment. "Trey. Trey." She looked at him. He was 27 or 28, she revised upward. The watchfulness was not just youth, it was the specific wariness of someone who had been in systems that punished mistakes early and had learned to read rooms before he was old enough to have good reason to. "You have priors?" "Some." "Violent?" "No." She believed him. The way he'd released Bev's arm had the quality of a person who was capable of threatening violence and preferred not to use it, which was not the same as someone who used it casually. "When Greer's people come through that door," she said, "you're going to tell them exactly what you told me. About Marcus coming here 3 nights ago, about the call that went out after they saw what I did. All of it." "That's not a small thing to ask." "I know." She held his eyes. "But you came back into this building alone and you let a 61-year-old nurse go because I mentioned her hip, and that tells me something about what you're actually capable of making yourself do." She paused. "Tell them the truth. It's the only version of tonight that ends better than the alternative." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Once." Emily tucked the card Declan had given her into her scrub pocket and walked back down the corridor to the junction where Greer's team was waiting. The next 2 hours were the kind that felt administrative but were actually structural, the kind of hours that determined the shape of everything that followed. Trey was taken into custody without incident and began talking within 20 minutes, which Emily learned from Greer's expression rather than anything he said directly. Bev was evaluated, confirmed uninjured, and then did what Bev always did, which was return to work, though Greer made her sit in a monitored room with coffee and a borrowed phone to call her daughter. Emily gave a second statement, longer than the first, that addressed the corridor interaction in precise and complete detail. She left out Harlan. She left out the real name. She left out the card in her pocket. These were omissions rather than lies, and the distinction mattered to her even in a night when most distinctions had been under considerable pressure. Reyes found her at 5:15 a.m., in the same break room where they'd started, which had by this point become a kind of base camp for a night that refused to conclude. "You got her out," Reyes said. She sat down with the directness of someone who had stopped performing neutrality. "The way you moved in that corridor, the way you read it." She put her elbows on the table. "I need you to stop pretending you're a night nurse." "I'm not pretending anything," Emily said. "I'm a licensed nurse. I've worked this shift for 2 years. Both of those things are completely true." "And the rest?" Emily looked at her. At the lines around her eyes, the specific tiredness in her face that wasn't just the hour, but the weight of something longer and more complicated. Reyes was not a bad person. Emily had concluded this sometime around 3 a.m., and had been working with the conclusion since. But good people in compromised offices could carry problems they didn't know they were carrying, and the problem Harlan had described was specific enough and sourced enough that Emily couldn't simply set it aside. "Agent Reyes," she said, "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Your preliminary report at 0100, who has access to it in your office before it's formally logged?" Reyes's expression changed, not dramatically, a slight shift in the muscles around her eyes, the micro-adjustment of someone who has just heard an unexpected question and is deciding whether to answer it honestly or carefully. She chose honestly. My supervisor and the duty analyst. Standard protocol. Names. A pause. Why? Because Trey came back into this building within minutes of that report being filed. Someone told him I was here and what I'd done and that I was under questioning. Emily kept her voice even. Someone with access to your report. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The silence of a competent person encountering a structural problem they had not previously seen and running the implications rapidly and without enjoying the process. Reyes's hand moved to her phone. She stopped herself. Then carefully, my supervisor is Gerald Foss. He's been with the IG's office for 11 years. The duty analyst tonight was a contractor named Pell, who's been on our team for... She stopped. How long? 8 months, Reyes said. The word came out with the flat quality of something that had just become very significant. 8 months. The same 8 months Harlan had mentioned. Emily watched Reyes do the arithmetic and watched the color of her expression change as she did it. Don't use your phone, Emily said. Not to call your office. Not to send anything to Foss or Pell or anyone connected to this case file. I have protocols for suspected... Your protocols go through systems that Pell has access to. If he's the leak, alerting him through standard channels tells him he's been identified before you can do anything about it. Emily leaned forward slightly. You need to make a call that goes above your office entirely. Someone who can freeze Pell's access before he can clear his trail. Reyes stared at her. How do you know this much about how a federal investigation gets contaminated? I've seen it happen, Emily said, which was true, and was also the most she was going to say about it at 5:15 in the morning in a hospital break room. Reyes sat for another moment. Then she stood, put her phone in her coat pocket without using it, and said, I need to borrow the hospital's landline. There's one at the charge desk, Emily said. Ask Bev. Reyes left. Emily sat alone for a while. The card from Declan was in her pocket, and she could feel it with the same specific awareness you feel a splinter, small, precise, persistent. 12 hours. It was now 5:20, which meant she had until approximately 5:20 this evening, and in that window she needed to make a decision that she had been structurally avoiding for 2 years. She thought about the valley. She thought about it the way she usually thought about it, in fragments rather than sequence, because sequence made it into a story, and she had found that stories made things too manageable, gave them the false resolution of narrative when what they actually were was permanent and unresolved. 4 people. Their names were Sergeant Dale Wickham, Corporal Sophia Ibarra, Specialist James Tran, and Private First Class Nolan Rue. And they had died in a valley because someone above their pay grade had changed the extraction window without telling anyone on the ground. And Emily had been 200 meters away coordinating a casualty evacuation when it happened. And she had been the one who filed the report. And the report had been modified before it was submitted. And she had known it had been modified and had been told, very clearly and by people with very significant authority, that pursuing the discrepancy was not something she was going to do. She had left 6 weeks later, had built Emily Carter in a rental apartment in Portland over the course of 3 months, then moved south to Ashford, then applied for the night position at Redwood Regional, then worked the supply carts and the documentation and the 12-hour shifts and the being told she was useless, and had kept that other part of herself quiet and contained and operational enough to function without being visible. And then a man named Marcus Duval had been watching her shift change 3 nights ago, and someone had decided to confirm a theory, and the night had unfolded the way nights do when you have been found. She had a choice. She could take the 12 hours and talk to Harlan and see what the real file contained, and accept that doing so would pull her back into a world she had left deliberately and at considerable personal cost. Or she could let the window close, let the file stay buried, let Reyes's investigation proceed with whatever it was going to produce, and rebuild Emily Carter somewhere else with a different name and a different hospital and a different supply cart to push through a different quiet corridor on a different night shift. She sat with both options for 3 minutes. Then she stood up and went to find Reyes. Reyes was at the charge desk using the landline, speaking quietly with the compressed urgency of someone who had made the decision to go above the standard channel and was now committed to what that meant. Bev was nearby, not pretending not to listen. Emily waited until Reyes finished the call. Done? Emily asked. IG's deputy director is being contacted through DoD channels. Pell's access is being frozen through the technical side rather than the administrative side, so he doesn't get a notification. Reyes put down the phone and looked at Emily. You were right about the channel. I know. Reyes looked at her with the expression that had been building all night, the one that was trying to find a category for what Emily was and kept coming up short. Who taught you that? Experience, Emily said, which was also true. I need your full background, not for the report, for me. Reyes said it without the official frame, just one person talking to another. Because I've been in this job for 9 years, and I have never seen a civilian do what you've done in this building tonight, and I need to understand what I'm looking at. Emily considered her, the landline call, the willingness to go outside standard protocol on Emily's recommendation alone, the 9 years of judgment that had produced that willingness. There's a name, Emily said carefully, a different name. It belongs to a service record that's classified, and I can't give it to you directly without creating a problem for both of us. But if someone with appropriate clearance requested it through DoD channels, it would answer your questions. She paused. The name that would get you there is Raymond Harlan, Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence. Reyes's expression recalibrated. You know Harlan. Not well. Well enough. He's been running a parallel investigation into the trafficking network for 6 months, separate from ours. There's been friction about jurisdiction. Reyes's voice had taken on the quality of someone assembling pieces that had been in separate piles. He reached out to my office twice, and both times Foss redirected the communication. Boss, Emily said, not Pell. The word landed. Reyes went very still. Foss redirected it, not Pell. She said it slowly, with the specific care of someone who has just realized they moved too fast and reached the wrong conclusion. Pell would have had access to my report, but Foss would have had it first. Foss had it the moment I filed. And Foss is 11 years in your office, Emily said. 11 years. Reyes's jaw tightened, not at Emily, at the arithmetic. Pell was a distraction. He's probably clean. She reached for the landline again. Emily put her hand on the receiver first, gently. If Foss has been in place for 11 years, he has 11 years of relationships in that office. Any call you make that goes through someone who knows Foss, I know. Reyes pulled her hand back. She was doing the math on her own network now, testing every connection for the specific contamination of a long-term placement, and Emily could see on her face how unpleasant that process was. I need to go directly to the IG himself, not through staff. That's what I'd do. Reyes looked at her. You should be in federal law enforcement. I had a different job, Emily said. The morning shift began arriving at 6:15, which meant the building acquired the particular energy of people walking into a situation they'd been briefed on secondhand and were trying to read in real time. 2-day shift nurses stopped in the corridor outside the trauma bay, looked at the residual evidence of the night, dried blood on the floor near the ambulance bay door, police tape at the radiology corridor entrance, an unusual number of people in suits, and made the faces of people processing something that hadn't been in the schedule. Dario came back in. He had apparently gone home and showered and come back, because he was in fresh clothes and had the specific alertness of someone who had slept for 90 minutes and was running on something stronger than rest. He found Emily at the central station, entering the last of her incident documentation, and stood next to her without speaking for a moment. I looked you up, he said. Emily kept typing. And? Nothing. There's basically nothing. You exist in all the right places, license, employment history, address, but it's all sort of, he paused, searching for the word, adjacent, like a sketch of a person rather than a person. That's a perceptive observation for 6:30 a.m. I'm a fast learner. He leaned on the counter. That woman you were talking to last night, the federal agent, she was on the phone for 20 minutes using the charge desk landline, and then she left in a hurry, and the man who was with her looked like someone had pulled the rug out from under him without him noticing yet. He paused. Did you do that? Emily stopped typing. She looked at him. What made you want to go into nursing? She asked. He blinked at the redirect. My mom was sick when I was 12. We spent a lot of time in hospitals. There was this one nurse who... He stopped. Why are you asking me this right now? Because I want to know if the answer is real or if it's the version you tell people. He was quiet for a moment. Both, he said finally. It started real, and then I told it enough times that it became a version, and now I'm not always sure which one I'm saying. That's an honest answer, Emily said. Is that what you were checking for? Sort of. She went back to her documentation. The version you tell people matters less than what you actually do when it's 3 a.m., and the attending has sent you to restock shelves, and there's a man dying on the floor. That's the real answer. You already have it. He absorbed this. What happens now? With everything. There's an investigation. Multiple ones. It'll take time and it'll be complicated, and some of it will be public and some of it won't. She saved the documentation file. What happens here, in this department, depends partly on what comes out and partly on who decides what to do with it. Hale, Dario said, among other things. He's been in his office since 4 a.m., Dario said. One of the day nurses said there was a hospital administrator in there with him at 5:30, and a woman from legal. Emily logged out of the workstation. People tend to have a lot of conversations in the morning after a night like this one. She was crossing toward the locker room to change when her phone buzzed. Not her personal phone, the secondary one, the one that had lived in the bottom of her locker since she'd arrived in Ashford, the one she had told herself she was keeping for emergencies only and had not touched in 2 years. It was buzzing now because someone had sent a message to a number that was not supposed to be findable by anyone who only knew Emily Carter. She stopped walking. She went to the locker room, opened her locker, and looked at the secondary phone for a moment before picking it up. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, and it contained 3 things: a file designation code that corresponded to a classification system she recognized from her service record, a time, 1400 hours, which was 8 hours from now, inside her 12-hour window, and an address in Ashford that she had never been to. Below the address, one more line. It said, Wickham, Ibarra, Tran, Rue. Come find out what actually happened. Emily stood in the locker room with the phone in her hand and the sound of the morning shift beginning to move through the department on the other side of the wall. And she understood that the decision she had been sitting with since 5 a.m. had just been made for her by 4 names written in a text message on a phone that wasn't supposed to exist. She put the phone in her pocket, closed the locker, and walked back out into the emergency department, where Dr. Victor Hale was emerging from his office with his coat on and the expression of a man whose morning had gone significantly worse than his night, flanked by a woman in a gray suit who had the purposeful tread of someone from hospital legal, and behind them a figure Emily hadn't seen before, a man in his 60s with the bearing of institutional authority, wearing a badge lanyard that identified him as the hospital's chief medical officer. Hale saw Emily across the department. The expression that moved across his face in that moment was complicated by several layers of things that had happened in the last 8 hours. But underneath all of them was something that looked, for the first time, like a reckoning he hadn't been able to prepare for. The woman from legal said something to Hale in a low voice. He nodded once, mechanically, and then the chief medical officer looked directly at Emily and said, in a voice that carried across the morning noise of the department, Ms. Carter, I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment. It was not a question, and the way Hale looked at the floor when it was said told Emily everything she needed to know about what conversation had been happening in that office since 5:30 in the morning. The chief medical officer's name was Dr. Ellison Marsh, and he had the particular quality of someone who had spent decades making institutional decisions and had learned, somewhere along the way, that the decisions that mattered most were the ones you made when the institution was watching you make them. He was 63, heavy-set, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he kept forgetting were there. His office on the 4th floor had a window that looked out over the hospital's main parking lot, and when Emily sat across from him at 7:15 in the morning, she could see the last of the overnight police vehicles pulling out. The yellow tape at the ambulance bay entrance still visible from this height. The ordinary traffic of an Ashford Tuesday beginning to move through the streets beyond. The woman from legal, her name was Sandra Prout, and she had the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to be a surface rather than a person in professional settings, sat to Marcia's left with a notepad and said very little. This was appropriate. What happened in this room was not primarily a legal conversation. I've reviewed the security footage from last night, Marsh said. He had a way of speaking that moved directly to the center of things, which Emily appreciated. All of it, from 2200 hours through to this morning. Emily waited. I've also read your incident report, Nurse Quintero's statement, the statements from 2 residents who were present during the initial incursion, and the preliminary summary from Lieutenant Greer's office. He folded his hands on the desk. and I've had a conversation with Dr. Hale. I heard, Emily said. Then you know the general shape of where this is going. He looked at her directly. What you did last night, the clinical management under duress, the decision-making in the corridor, the protection of staff and patients throughout, was not what I expected to find when I sat down with this footage at 5 a.m. He paused. I want to be straightforward with you. The way Dr. Hale has managed this department, and specifically the way he has managed staff in this department, has been a concern that has reached my desk before. What last night produced, in terms of documentation and witness accounts and footage, is sufficient to act on those concerns in a way that was previously difficult. Because previously it was his word and his record against people he had authority over, Emily said. Yes. Marsh said it without softening. That's an accurate summary of why institutional patterns like his persist. The person doing the harm is also the person whose judgment the institution relies on to evaluate the harm. He unfolded his hands. The review board convenes next week. His privileges are suspended as of this morning, pending outcome. That's not a conversation I'm having with you to ask for your input. It's information you're entitled to as someone directly affected. Emily looked at the parking lot. The last police vehicle turned onto the main road and disappeared. Ms. Carter, Marsh said, I want to offer you something, and I want to do it now rather than after the review process, because I think waiting would be the wrong way to handle this. He picked up a folder from his desk and opened it. The Director of Emergency Training position has been vacant for 14 months. We haven't been able to fill it in a way that felt right for the department. After what I watched on that footage last night, the way you managed staff, the way you communicated under pressure, the clinical judgment you demonstrated, I'd like you to consider it. Sandra Prout wrote something on her notepad. Emily looked at the folder, at the title on the top page, at her own name, the one on her nursing license, the one that had been Emily Carter for 2 years, printed beneath it in the clean formatting of an official offer. I need to be honest with you about something, Emily said. Marsh looked at her steadily. I expected you might. My background is more complicated than what's in the employment file. She said it without preamble because there was no version of the next week that didn't require this to be said, and saying it now, in this room, on her own terms, was better than every alternative. There are people who are going to be asking questions about that background over the next several days. Federal questions. The answers are going to produce information that changes some of what you know about who you hired 2 years ago. Will any of it reflect negatively on your clinical competence or your conduct in this hospital? No. Will it reflect negatively on your character? Emily thought about the Valley, about 4 names on a text message, about 2 years of supply carts and midnight shifts, and being told she was a liability. That depends on who's evaluating it, she said, but my own answer is no. Marsh nodded once. Then leave the folder with you. Look at it when the dust has settled. He closed his copy. Whatever your background turns out to be, what I saw on that footage is the standard I want in this department. The rest is details. Emily picked up the folder. She left his office at 7:40 and took the stairs instead of the elevator, which she did when she needed the 2 flights to think. The secondary phone was in her pocket. 1,400 hours, 8 hours and change. She had made her decision at the moment she'd read the 4 names. She'd known she had. The thinking since then had been the work of confirming something already true rather than reaching something new, and she was experienced enough with herself to know the difference between deliberation and rationalization. The address was in the warehouse district on the east side of Ashford, which was the kind of area that existed in every mid-sized city, converted industrial buildings, a few legitimate businesses, a lot of square footage that changed hands quietly and didn't advertise. She had driven through it twice in 2 years without particular reason. She would need to know more about the specific building before 1400, and she would need to tell someone where she was going, because walking into an unknown location based on a text message on a covert phone was the kind of thing that even her previous training had categorized as requiring a backup plan. The question of who to tell had one answer that made sense, and it was not an answer she entirely liked. She found Reyes in the hospital's administrative conference room on the 2nd floor, which had apparently become the de facto federal operations space for the morning. The mail agent, whose name Emily had still never learned, was on a laptop in the corner. Reyes was on a call that she wrapped up in 90 seconds when Emily came in, with the focused efficiency of someone who had reorganized their morning entirely in the last 2 hours. Foss, Reyes said before Emily could speak. It was Foss. My director made contact with the IG at 6:45. Boss's access was suspended at 7. He doesn't know yet. She said it with the particular flatness of someone delivering information that was professionally significant and personally difficult. 11 years, she'd said, and Emily understood that 11 years in a shared office meant something regardless of what that person turned out to be. He was the one who redirected Harlan's communications. He was the one who flagged your name to the network last night. Have they found the connection? How Foss was linked to the network? Still running it down. But there's a financial trail that goes back at least 4 years. Reyes sat down. The trafficking operation has been paying for protection through a series of intermediary accounts. Foss is 3 steps from the source, but the steps aren't complicated. She looked at Emily. This is going to be a significant case. Multiple jurisdictions, DoD involvement because of the connection to, she paused, to whatever your actual background is, which I still don't have. Emily put the secondary phone on the table between them. I received this at 6:50 this morning. Reyes read the message. She read it twice. She looked at the file designation code for a long moment, and from her expression she recognized the classification system even if she didn't know the specific content. Harlan, she said, the address and the time are his. The names are the reason I'm going. Reyes looked at her. Those are your team. Yes. A silence. Not uncomfortable, the kind that forms when something real has been said and the room is adjusting to the weight of it. You know I can't sanction you walking into an unsecured location based on a text message, Reyes said. I know. And you're going anyway. I'm going to find out what happened to 4 people who died because someone changed the extraction window and then changed the record. Emily kept her voice level. I've been waiting 2 years. I'm not waiting longer because the paperwork isn't right. Reyes looked at the phone, looked at Emily, looked at the male agent in the corner who had stopped typing and was listening with the stillness of someone who had learned to be useful by being quiet. Karev, Reyes said to him, pull the building registration for that address. He started typing. Reyes looked back at Emily. You're not going alone. I wasn't planning to ask you to come. You didn't ask. She stood. I'm telling you, whatever Harlan has in that file, if it connects to Foss, if it connects to the network, if it connects to a classified operation that got 4 soldiers killed, that's not just your history. That's an active federal matter. She picked up the secondary phone and handed it back to Emily. And I owe you one for Foss. Emily looked at her. You don't owe me anything. I had the wrong person. Reyes said it simply. For 3 hours I had the wrong person, and you're the one who corrected it. In my world that creates an obligation. She pulled on her coat. So, we have until 1400. The building on Kellerman Street in the warehouse district turned out to be registered to a logistics company that Karev traced in 40 minutes to a subsidiary that connected, through 2 more steps, to a DoD contractor that had worked with Defense Intelligence on 3 separate projects in the last decade. This was either reassuring or deeply concerning, depending on how you read Harlan, and Emily had spent the drive across Ashford holding both possibilities at exactly equal weight. The building itself was a converted machine shop, 2 stories, brick exterior, loading bay on the south side that had been sealed, a single entrance on the street face with a security panel that accepted the code Declan had given Reyes over the phone at 11 a.m. when she'd called the number on the card. He had given it without significant resistance, which meant either Harlan had anticipated this or had instructed him to accommodate it, and Emily wasn't sure which of those was more interesting. Harlan was inside. He was older than she'd imagined from his voice, mid-60s, with the lean, careful quality of someone who had spent a career in rooms where everything was permitted except imprecision. He was seated at a table with a laptop, 2 external drives, and a printer that had already produced a significant stack of documents. He looked up when Emily and Reyes came in, and he took in Reyes's presence with one long assessment before apparently deciding it was acceptable. Agent Reyes, he said, your office has been having a difficult morning. It has, Reyes said. Voss is suspended. I know. He looked at Emily. Sergeant Voss. Carter, Emily said. He accepted this with a small nod. Carter. He stood and gestured at the table. Sit down, both of you. This is going to take some time to go through properly, and I'd rather do it once. What followed was 2 hours that Emily had been owed for 2 years, and they were not easy hours. The file Harlan had was not a single document. It was a reconstruction, assembled from signals intercepts, financial records, contractor communications, and the statements of two individuals whose names Emily did not recognize but whose roles she understood immediately. They were the people who had made the decision to change the extraction window. Not Harlan, not anyone Emily had suspected. Two men who occupied positions in a contracting structure that existed 3 layers above the operational level, and who had changed the window for reasons that were, in the reconstruction, starkly and mundanely self-interested. A competing team had been positioned to extract a high-value asset from the same area, and the window change had been a territorial decision, an institutional chess move made by people who would never be in the valley and would never have to see what their timing decision produced on the ground. 4 people, for a jurisdictional dispute between contractors. Emily sat with this for a long time. Not the whole 2 hours, she was present and engaged and asking precise questions throughout, but part of her sat with it separately, in a quieter place, where the arithmetic of it could be fully received rather than processed. Wickham, Ibarra, Tran, Rue. Harlan said, at one point, "I want to be clear that I did not know at the time. My clearance didn't touch that layer of the contracting structure until 14 months ago. When I found it, I started building this." He looked at Emily. "I also found the modification to your report. The version you submitted and the version that was filed are different in 11 specific places. I have both." Emily looked at the original. Her own words, unmodified, the sequence of events as she had recorded them immediately after, when her hands had still been unsteady, and she had written anyway because she understood that the record was what survived when everything else was gone. "What happens now?" she said, "with the 2 men?" "They're no longer in their positions, both retired in the last 18 months, but retirement isn't a legal shield, and what's in this file is sufficient to reopen the investigation into the incident." Harlan's voice was careful. "It will be a slow process. It won't look like what you might want it to look like." "I know what legal accountability looks like," Emily said. "I've worked in emergency medicine for 2 years. Things rarely look like what you want them to look like." Something moved across Harlan's expression. Not quite a smile. The recognition, maybe, of someone who has maintained a functional grip on reality through a long and difficult stretch, and is still holding it. Reyes had been quiet for most of the 2 hours, taking notes with the focused attention of someone constructing a parallel case file in real time. She spoke up at the end. "The trafficking network. The connection to Foss. Does any of this," she gestured at the documents, "connect to how that network was operating without federal interference?" "Foss was protecting them from your office," Harlan said, "but they had a second layer of protection that was separate from Foss. Someone in the contracting structure who had been using the network for logistics." He pulled a document from the stack. "This is what Marcus Duval knew. This is why he came to the hospital to observe Carter, to confirm whether she was the medic from the incident, the one person who had filed an original accurate report. Because the people who used the network for logistics are the same people who changed the extraction window, and if the report discrepancy was ever reopened, she was the witness." The room was quiet. Emily looked at this document, then at Reyes. "They weren't just trying to keep me from talking about my team," Emily said. "They were trying to keep me from becoming a witness to a separate crime." "That's correct," Harlan said. Reyes put down her pen. "That makes Carter a material witness in a federal trafficking and corruption case." "It does." "Which means she needs protection." "She's been protecting herself for 2 years," Harlan said, with a dryness that was the closest he'd come to humor. "I think she has some relevant experience." Emily looked at her own original report, still on the table in front of her. The words she had written the night after the Valley, in a forward operating base that smelled like diesel and processed air, trying to put in writing the exact sequence of events so that the record would be correct even if everything else went wrong. The record had been changed, now it was being changed back. It was not a dramatic process. It did not feel the way she had sometimes imagined it might, in the 18 months when she'd still been allowing herself to imagine. It felt like sitting at a table in a converted machine shop in the warehouse district of a city she'd landed in by design, reading documents on a Tuesday morning, while a federal agent took notes and a man who had spent a year building a case explained how it fit together. It felt like work, like the hard and unglamorous process of reassembling the truth from the pieces that had been scattered. It felt, in other words, like exactly what it was. They left the building at 4:15. Reyes had a call to make to her director that could no longer wait, and she made it from the parking lot while Emily stood near the car and looked at the ordinary street and the late afternoon light and the way Ashford looked from the warehouse district, smaller than it had seemed from the hospital, more navigable, a city that had contained an enormous amount of compressed consequence in the last 16 hours, and was now simply sitting in the autumn sun looking like itself. Her phone buzzed. The regular one. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Dario, who had apparently gotten her number from the nursing department directory and felt this required no justification. It said, "Hale's privileges were suspended. The whole department knows. Are you okay?" She looked at it for a moment, then typed back, "Yes, thank you for asking." A pause. Then, "Bev says you're taking the training director position." Emily looked at Reyes, still on her call, at the building behind them, at the file folder she was carrying that contained a copy of her original report, given to her by Harlan without being asked. She typed, "Tell Bev she's ahead of herself." Another pause. Then, "She says that's a yes." Emily put the phone in her pocket. The next 3 weeks were not simple. Investigations of the kind that had been set in motion by a single night in an emergency department do not resolve quickly or cleanly. They resolve in stages, with setbacks and procedural complications, and the particular frustration of watching institutions move at institutional speed toward conclusions that seem obvious to anyone standing close enough to the evidence. Gerald Foss was formally placed on administrative leave on day 2 and arrested on day 9, when the financial trail Karev had started pulling had been fully traced to its source. The charge was obstruction of a federal investigation, with additional charges related to his role in suppressing information about the trafficking network pending further review. He did not look, in the photograph that ran in the Ashford Register, like someone who had expected this. He looked like someone who had made 11 years of small compromises and had somehow convinced himself that this was a different thing than what it was. The 2 men from the contracting structure, a project director named Walcott and a senior logistics coordinator named Brenner, were formally notified on day 14 that the investigation into the Valley incident had been reopened. Their lawyers responded within hours, which told Emily something about how long they had been expecting this call. The process would take time. She had made her peace with time. What she had not made peace with and did not intend to was the idea that the process would not eventually conclude with something that resembled accountability, and Harlan's file gave her more confidence in that outcome than she'd had in 2 years. Marcus Duval survived his surgery. I was in stable condition by day 3 and under federal protective custody by day 5, having agreed, through his attorney, to provide full cooperation with the investigation in exchange for considerations on his own charges. His information, added to what Trey had told police on the night of the incident, produced a map of the trafficking network's Ashford operations that the federal team described, in language Emily heard secondhand through Reyes, as more complete than anything they'd built in 8 months of investigation. Trey pled to a lesser charge. He had a lawyer who was better than Emily had expected, which suggested that either he had resources she hadn't identified or someone in the legal system had taken an interest in the specifics of his case. He did 18 months. She didn't know what happened after that. She hoped for something better than what had come before, but she had enough experience with how things actually went to hold the hope lightly. Victor Hale's review board convened on day 6 and concluded on day 8. The footage from the previous 18 months of department cameras, which had been reviewed at Marsh's request after the incident, showed a pattern of behavior that was both more systematic and more documented than anyone had apparently realized or been willing to say out loud. The formal findings included repeated violations of staff conduct protocols, documented instances of patient care interference, and what the board characterized as a sustained pattern of intimidation that had affected department function and staff retention in measurable ways. He lost his clinical privileges. He lost his position. He retained his medical license pending a separate review by the state board, which was its own process, slower and more uncertain, but moving. He did not fight the hospital findings publicly, which suggested his lawyers had told him something that his prior certainty had never admitted, that the footage was comprehensive and the documentation was sufficient, and the staff who had been silent for years were no longer silent. Emily was not present at the board hearing. She was asked whether she wanted to give a statement, and she said she had already given one, in her incident report, and that it stood. She started the Director of Emergency Training position on a Monday, 6 weeks after the night of the incident. Marsh had held the offer open without pressuring her, which she had noted and appreciated. The role was different from what she'd spent 2 years doing. It required her to be visible in ways that the night shift had not. To speak with authority in rooms rather than demonstrate it quietly in corridors. To teach what she knew rather than simply know it. It was harder in some ways and easier in others. The hardness was the visibility. The ease was the directness. Finally being in a room as herself, or the version of herself that existed in this life, without the constant low maintenance of concealment. On her third day in the new role, she ran a trauma simulation with the department's nursing staff. 12 people. She had designed this scenario herself, drawing on the specific gaps she had observed in the department's response during the incident. Communication breakdowns under pressure, failure of clear role assignment in dynamic environments, the tendency of individuals to defer to titles rather than competencies in moments when titles were the least useful organizing principle available. The simulation was not perfectly executed. 3 people made the mistakes she'd anticipated, 2 made different mistakes she hadn't, and 1, Dario, who had been included in the session at her recommendation, made a decision under pressure that was technically incorrect, but reflected exactly the right instinct, which was its own kind of useful data. She debriefed them for 40 minutes afterward, not as a performance of authority, but as the thing she had always actually been in any room she'd ever worked in, the person paying closest attention to everything. "You froze at the handoff," she said to one of the nurses, a second year who had excellent clinical instincts and a tendency to go still when she needed to go loud. "Not because you didn't know what to do, because you were waiting for someone to confirm that you knew." The nurse looked at her. "How do you fix that?" "You practice deciding before you feel certain. Certainty comes after, if it comes at all. Waiting for it costs time you don't have." She looked at the group. "That's the thing nobody tells you about emergency medicine. You are never going to feel ready. The readiness you have is the readiness you brought in the door, and you build it outside the room so you have it inside the room. That's what this is for." Bev, who had sat in on the session as charge nurse, caught Emily's eye from the back of the room. Her expression was the expression of someone who had worked 30 years in a department and was watching something be done correctly, which for Bev was an emotion that expressed itself as very slight, very contained satisfaction. It was not a look Emily had seen from anyone in this department directed at her before. It was, she found, worth something. The formal recognition from the Department of Defense came in the form of a letter and a ceremony that Emily attended alone, which was her choice. The letter recognized her actions during the Ashford incident in language that was precise and without flourish, acknowledging the lives protected, the evidence preserved, the information provided to federal investigators, and the conduct under conditions that the letter described as demanding in a way that only people who had been in demanding conditions would understand was significant understatement. The ceremony was small. Harlan was there. Reyes was there. An officer she didn't know read the citation. She received a commendation that had her real name on it, Sergeant Ilara Voss, the name that belonged to the service record, to the Valley, to 4 people who deserved to be remembered accurately. She had both names now, not in conflict, not one buried under the other. Both present, both true, the way people accumulate the selves they've survived. Harlan spoke to her briefly afterward, in the parking lot of the DoD regional office, in the gray November light. "The investigation into Walcott and Brenner," he said. "It'll take 2 years, maybe 3. I know. You're all right with that?" Emily thought about the question, about what all right meant when the answer was 2 or 3 years, and the thing you were waiting for was justice for people who were already gone. "I'm not all right with it," she said. "I'm prepared for it. Those are different things." He nodded. He seemed to have expected something like this. "If you need anything from my office during the process, I know how to find you," she said. She drove back to the hospital, not because she needed to, her shift didn't start until the next morning, but because she had a stack of training materials on her desk that she wanted to review, and because she had found, over the past 6 weeks, that the building had become something she hadn't expected it to become when she'd first walked through its doors 2 years ago as a woman trying to disappear into the geometry of someone ordinary. It had become a place she belonged, not in the soft, uncomplicated sense, in the real sense, The sense that includes the night she'd spent on a concrete floor with her hands in a wound, and the morning after when the whole structure of what she'd built as Emily Carter had started to give way to something that was both smaller and truer. In the sense that includes being told you're useless at the beginning of a shift, and then being offered a position by the man who runs the department before the sun comes up on the same night. She was at her desk when Dario knocked and came in. He had a mug of coffee that he set on her desk without asking, and then stood there with the expression of someone who had something to say and was working out how to say it. "I've been thinking about applying to PA school," he said. Emily looked up. "Okay. I wanted to tell someone." He paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you specifically. Because I'll tell you whether it's a good idea instead of just being encouraging," she said. He considered this. "Is it a good idea?" She looked at him, at the person who had stood in a trauma bay at midnight and watched everything with those wide, filing eyes, and had come back the next morning and the morning after that. "Yes," she said. "Apply." He nodded. Looked like he was going to leave, then didn't. "That night, when everything was happening, you knew the whole time what you were doing, didn't you? Not just the medical stuff, the whole thing." Emily looked at her desk, at the training materials, at the folder in the corner with her original report inside it, which she kept there not as a reminder of the wound, but as a reminder of the record, of the importance of writing things down correctly, even when someone has the power to change them, because the original still exists somewhere, and the people who look for it will eventually find it. "I knew some of it," she said. "The rest I figured out as I went, same as everyone else." "That's not the impression you gave." "Good," she said. "That's the point." He left, and she heard him in the corridor saying something to Bev, and she heard Bev's dry response, and she heard them both move away down the hall, and the department settled into the particular rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon that had nothing urgent in it, which was its own kind of gift. She thought about the 4 names. She thought about them less constantly than she had in the first weeks, not because they mattered less, but because she had found that the most honest thing she could do with the people she'd lost was live forward in a way that was equal to what they'd given. Not performing grief, not performing recovery, just doing the actual work in front of her, every day, with the full weight of everything she knew and everything she'd been through brought to bear on the room she was in. That was what they'd done. That was what all the best people she'd known in that life had done. You brought everything you were to everything in front of you, and you didn't wait to feel ready, and you didn't wait to be seen, and you didn't wait for the institution to recognize what you were doing before you kept doing it. The recognition, when it came, was not the thing that made the work real. The work had always been real. She opened the training manual and began to revise the section on emergency communication protocols, because the simulation on Monday had shown her 3 specific places where the existing language would cause a person to hesitate when they needed to move. And hesitation in those moments cost something that couldn't be recovered, and she had the knowledge to fix it, and fixing it was the job. A young nurse appeared in her office doorway, new, 2 weeks into her first rotation, with the specific alertness of someone in the process of learning how large the gap between training and real is. She had a question about a documentation protocol. Emily looked up. "Sit down," she said. "I'll walk you through it." The young nurse sat. Outside the window, Ashford went about its afternoon. Somewhere across the city, in a federal building Emily had visited twice in the last 6 weeks, the case file bearing her real name was being assembled by people who understood its significance. Somewhere in a surgical recovery ward 2 floors up, a body was healing from a wound that had been managed well enough on a concrete floor to give the surgery something to work with. Somewhere in the legal machinery of the state and federal systems, accountability was moving at its slow, grinding, imperfect pace toward people who had spent years believing they were beyond its reach. None of that was in this room. In this room, there was a young nurse with a question about documentation and an afternoon that didn't require anything more than the ordinary practice of someone who knew what she was doing. That had always been the real mission, not the title, not the commendation, not the ceremony with her name correctly spelled on a document. This, the young nurse across the desk, the protocol that needed clarifying, the next person who would be better at their job because someone had taken the time to sit down and show them how. The uniform, the rank, the classified record, the 2 years of deliberate invisibility. None of it had ever been the point. The point was always here, in this room, in the next person who needed something that she had to give. Emily Carter looked at the young nurse who was opening her notepad with the focused attention of someone who intended to learn, and she thought, this is what it was for. All of it. Every part. She began to explain.